The wind swept across the endless plains of Montana, carrying with it the kind of silence that could swallow a person whole. But what happened next would make even the most hardened of hearts stand still in awe. Like and subscribe if you've ever been caught between doing what's right and what your heart tells you to do, because what comes next will change everything. Leona James had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who would marry out of necessity. For years, she'd held fast to her independence, working the land that her father had left behind, building a life that was hers alone. But as the last of the summer light faded, painting the horizon in shades of purple and gold, a figure appeared on her doorstep that threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. Caleb Marshall wasn't like any man she had known. His broad shoulders and quiet presence seemed to stretch out into the very vastness of the land itself. He wasn't here to charm her with sweet words or promises of a love that was always meant to be. No, when he looked at her, his eyes were as hard and as unreadable as the distant mountains, and he spoke the words that would change her world forever. "I need a wife," he said, the words falling from his lips like a heavy stone. "And you need security. No flowery talk, no romantic gestures, just the bluntness of a man who had long been used to surviving alone in a world that offered no softness." Caleb didn't ask, he didn't plead. He simply laid it out before her, his proposition both practical and painfully clear. She was 33, a woman who had buried the idea of love beneath years of hard work and loneliness. What did she have to lose? As the cold winds of winter began to blow in, Leona found herself standing at a crossroads. Was it really a choice, or was it survival? Could she really marry a man she barely knew, not for love, but for something far more sensible, like safety? As she looked into Caleb's dark, stormy eyes, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his proposal settle deep into her chest. He didn't want her for the usual reasons. He didn't want her for the warmth of a woman's touch or the promise of a future filled with passion. He wanted her to take care of his ranch, to stand beside him in a harsh, unforgiving world. And, in return, she would have a roof over her head and food in her belly come winter's brutal chill. It was a deal, simple as that. But what neither of them knew was that this was the start of something much deeper, something neither of them could control. And as the days passed and the temperature dropped, Leona began to wonder if she was making a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Was this the beginning of her survival, or was it the end of the dreams she once had? The day of the wedding came faster than Leona had expected, as if the hands of time had conspired to push her into a future she hadn't chosen for herself. She hadn't even picked out a dress. Instead, she wore the simple brown wool that had become her second skin in a life lived largely in the solitude of her farm, where the only audience for her was the wind and the animals. Caleb had given her no grand expectations, no romantic gestures, just a simple plan, a small ceremony, a quick exchange of vows, and a promise to make it work. They were both too practical for anything else. But as she sat there in the tiny church, with only a handful of people in attendance, neighbors and ranchers from the surrounding land, Leona couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Her eyes flickered nervously to Caleb, who stood tall and composed at the altar, his dark eyes focused ahead, as calm as the Montana sky before a storm. There was something in his presence, something solid and unshakable, that made the world feel as though it could crumble around them, and they would still stand firm. But when the preacher called for them to exchange vows, it was the simplicity of his words that made Leona's heart skip. Caleb's voice was steady, not overly emotional, but it carried an earnestness that hit deeper than she had expected. "I vow to give you the security you need," he said, his eyes catching hers for the briefest of moments. "And I promise to protect you, in this world and the next." The words were not the passionate promises she had once imagined as a young woman, but they were real. They were grounded in the harshness of the land, in the things that mattered most when survival was the only thing on the line. When the preacher turned to her, Leona's throat tightened, and for a moment, she considered backing out, running out the door and disappearing into the prairie. But something in her knew, deep down, that she wasn't just marrying for survival anymore. There was something else growing between them, a bond, a respect, something unexpected. When she said, "I do," she felt a surge of uncertainty ripple through her, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a a quiet kind of hope. As the ceremony ended and the small congregation clapped politely, Caleb took her hand in his. The gesture was simple, yet it felt as though the whole world had shifted in that one moment. And then, without warning, he leaned down and kissed her. Just a gentle press of lips, but it was enough. A kiss of promises, unspoken but understood. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Something that might grow, if only they allowed it to. As they stepped out of the church together, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of winter's first snow. And for the first time since he had walked into her life, Leona allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was not the end of the life she had once imagined, but the beginning of a new one. The weeks following the wedding were quieter than Leona had expected, a strange blend of comfort and discomfort as she tried to adjust to the rhythms of a life that was both new and strangely familiar. Caleb, for all his imposing presence, was an unexpected presence in her life. Calm, reserved, and surprisingly gentle in the way he handled the ranch, the land, and even her. He didn't demand her attention, didn't rush her into anything. He let her keep her teaching position at the school, and he respected her independence, even as he watched her quietly settle into the role of his wife. At night, they ate their meals together, but there was no rush to speak, no forced conversation. Sometimes, he would share stories of his years spent as a drifter, of the lands he had seen, the people he had met. But those stories were always brief, and though Leona listened intently, she could tell there was something in his past he wasn't sharing. Something that kept him distant, even as his actions spoke of care. A man who would go to great lengths to protect her, to ensure she had everything she needed, but kept his own heart hidden, like a treasure locked away in a chest. One night, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear like scattered diamonds across the black sky, Leona asked, "Caleb, how did you end up here? I mean, you came out of nowhere. Redfern Ridge doesn't exactly get many visitors." For a long time, Caleb didn't answer. He simply stared into the vastness of the night, his eyes narrowed as if searching for something in the distance. She had come to understand that he was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was always with weight, with purpose. Finally, after a long pause, he turned to her. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," he said simply, his voice low, almost as though he were testing the words to see if they would feel true. "I spent years running, trying to outrun what I'd done. But the land, it has a way of making you stop. You can't keep running forever." Leona's curiosity piqued, but she didn't press him further. She had learned to give him space, to let him share when he was ready, though a small part of her wondered what it was that haunted him. His past was something he had never fully spoken about, not even to her. There was the faintest hint of something in his eyes when he spoke about his days before coming to Redfern Ridge, a pain, an unspeakable loss. But it was always followed by an abrupt shift, a change in his tone, as if he could bury it again, safely, without sharing it. But as the weeks went by, something shifted between them. There were small moments, moments that meant so much more than words. The way his hand lingered on hers when they passed each other in the hallway, the way he always made sure her chair was pushed in when they ate together, the way he would walk just a little slower when they went into town, matching his pace to hers. It was subtle, the way he was learning to care for her, to show affection in a way that didn't come easily to him. One evening, as winter settled firmly into the valley and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, Leona was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. Caleb had been outside most of the day, tending to the cattle and reinforcing the fences against the fierce winter winds. He came inside, his coat dusted with snow, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and immediately, he shed his layers, hanging them by the door. As he passed her in the kitchen, he placed a hand on her shoulder, just for a moment. It was warm, strong, and it sent a shock of heat straight through her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she glanced up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual, "for everything you've done, for making this place feel like home." Caleb didn't speak for a long while. He simply watched her, as though he were trying to decide whether to say something more, something deeper. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear. "You've done more than that," he said, his words surprising her. "You've made it worth living again." It was as though the air between them shifted, thickened, and for a fleeting moment, The walls that had kept them apart seemed to melt away. They were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance, but two people who had somehow found something between them, something real, something worth fighting for. But even as that moment passed, Leona knew it wasn't love. Not yet. They were still learning each other, still navigating the quiet spaces between them. Still, as the days turned into weeks and then into months, she began to feel something stir inside of her. A longing, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. She found herself thinking about Caleb more than she cared to admit, wondering what it would be like to truly love him, to give herself to him completely. One afternoon, as she was walking back from the schoolhouse, Caleb's silhouette appeared on the porch. He was leaning against the railing, staring out at the snow-covered fields beyond. She hesitated for a moment before walking up to him, unsure of the tension between them. He didn't speak right away, but when she reached the porch, he turned to her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. Leona stopped in front of him, her heart racing. "Caleb," she began, unsure of how to continue. But before she could say more, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for hers. For the briefest of moments, they just stood there, locked in a silent exchange. Then, in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing, he pulled her toward him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was slow, tender, and full of promises they hadn't yet spoken. It was their first kiss that was not born out of duty, not forced or expected, but given in quiet understanding and shared recognition of something growing between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something more. Something that, in time, might become love. As the winter winds howled outside, they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, knowing that no matter what the future held, they had found something worth fighting for. Together.